Do you ever wonder why states give schools ratings? It shouldn't be to create a list of supposedly good or bad schools. Rather, it's to identify schools where students need extra help, support, and resources. Improving schools identified as low-performing requires our leaders to give them additional funding and close resource gaps. But it turns out many identified schools aren't getting what they need. Across 8 of the 9 states we examined, at least 1/4 of schools spent less per pupil after being identified as needing extra support, not more. In many cases, this means the schools states identified as having the greatest needs were actually spending more than $1,000 less per student. Did this happen because there wasn't enough funding for all identified schools? The answer is yes. Remember, nearly 1/4 of identified schools in most states spent less per pupil after being identified for support. But when only federal spending is included, not state and local dollars, 1/4 of schools in every state spent less per pupil after being identified. Even worse, in 5 states, more than 1/3 of schools spent less from federal dollars after they were identified. This happened even though states must set aside federal funding to distribute to identified schools. That money just wasn't enough to go around. Lack of federal funding isn't the only problem. States and localities also aren't pulling their weight. When schools spent less per pupil overall after being identified, between 43 and 90% of them spent less from federal sources. But between 68 and 97% spent less from state and local sources. So, what can be done to get identified schools the resources they need? First, to ensure there's enough funding to go around, Congress should increase what's called the 7% Title I set-aside, which is the portion of federal money reserved just for school improvement. Second, to ensure funding is more targeted to identify schools, state legislators should review their funding formulas to direct more money to identify schools, including by adding funding streams exclusively for school improvement. These recommendations would help ensure that all low-performing schools receive the level of funding they need to help them improve educational outcomes for the students they serve. Learn more at offerat.org.